Our first speaker and presentation is Dr. Carol Anderson. Dr. Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University. She's the author of White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Nation's Divide. She spends a lot of time teaching and thinking and speaking on how the racial inequity and racism of our country affects the processes and outcomes we see, and particularly in the voting framework. She is well published and is oftentimes quoted in everything from the New York Times to Washington Post. She's done The Daily Show, Rachel Maddow's show on MSNBC, Hello Privilege, it's Chelsea on Netflix. She's out there helping change our country for the better. And so without further ado, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for being here on a Saturday afternoon. I'm going to talk about voting rights, and I'm a historian, so I'm going to walk us through very quickly. It's going to be the Cliff Notes version of voting history, and then I'm going to move us into where we are today. To understand how we got here is to understand the Mississippi Plan of 1890. In the Mississippi Plan of 1890, the legislators in Mississippi looked at this large African American population that had the right to vote and said, how do we stop them from voting? And how do we do it in a way that doesn't violate the 15th Amendment of the Constitution that says that the state shall not abridge the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude? How do you do that? And so what Mississippi decided to do was to take the societally imposed conditions on that population and make those conditions, like poverty and illiteracy, become the access into the ballot box. And so poverty, because of centuries of slavery, and then moving into Jim Crow. Illiteracy, when you don't fund schools, and then you require people to have to read and interpret areas of the Constitution to the liking of the registrar. By the time we got to 1940, when the US is getting ready to fight Nazis, only 3% of African American adults were registered to vote in the South. 3%. The Mississippi Plan was very effective, and that is what the battle for the right to vote in the civil rights movement, that was one of the key battles. And that's why we end up with Selma and then the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was one of the most impressive and successful pieces of legislation that Congress has ever passed. What it did was it required that those states that had a history of discrimination, and that was defined by fewer than 50% of their age-eligible adults were registered to vote. Because you're looking on fewer than 50% of all of your adults are registered, something's going on. So that was one of the tests. But the other part of the test was that you used one of those devices from the Mississippi Plan, a poll tax, a literacy test, the white primary, one of those things that would depress your voter registration. If you had both of those, then you had to have every one of your voting laws okayed by the US Department of Justice before it was implemented, which then stopped a lot of the craziness that we saw. It meant that you didn't have to keep going back to court over and over and over, adjudicating something while politicians are getting into power based on a massively disfranchised population. And it worked. It worked so that in early 1960, about 5% of Black adults in Mississippi were registered to vote, only 5%. By 1967, 2 years after the Voting Rights Act, it was almost 60%. I mean, this thing is working. It was working so much that it caused this kind of incredible backlash. South Carolina came after it, then Virginia, Mississippi, the Nixon administration, the Reagan administration. This thing is working. So how is it that we ended up here? I'm going to fast forward to the election of Barack Obama. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected president of the United States. One of the things that we often hear is, well, how racist can America be because we put a black man in the White House? And there's this kind of congratulatory pat on the back, yay, look what we did, and we did it twice. Actually, the majority of whites who vote have not voted for a Democratic candidate for president since 1964. The majority have not voted for a Democratic candidate since 1964, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, recognizing the citizenship rights of African Americans. So how on earth did Barack Obama become president? Well, he had an incredible ground game. And in that ground game, grassroots, knocking on doors, getting folks registered to vote, getting people from their homes to the polls and back. In that, they brought 15 million new voters to the polls, people who had never voted before. Overwhelmingly African American, Hispanic, Asian American, young, and poor. That would become the hit list for voter suppression. In 2013, the US Supreme Court, in the Shelby County v. Holder decision, gutted the Voting Rights Act. Within 2 hours after that decision, states that had been chomping at the bit to try to figure out how do we suppress all of those voters who are becoming the majority of voters in the United States, how do we suppress them, began implementing voter suppression laws. Again, to figure out how do we suppress the vote, but stay on this side of the 15th Amendment, just like the Mississippi Plan of 1890. Some of those tactics, and I'm going to walk us through some of them, and realize that they're all predicated on the lie of voter fraud. And voter fraud is a lie. Justin Levitt, a law professor out of California, found that out of 1 billion votes from 2000 to 2014, there were only 31 cases of voter impersonation fraud. 31 out of 1 billion. I'm glad I'm at Georgia Tech where somebody can do the math on that. But it's like 0.00000000000 in terms of this massive rampant voter fraud that we hear as the justification for all of these laws. Voter ID. Voter ID is designed to sound reasonable. Everybody has an ID. But what these legislators have done is to pull data to determine what races have what types of ID, and then privilege the kinds of IDs that whites have, and knock off and make ineligible the other kinds. For instance, Alabama passed a voter ID law before Shelby County v. Holder in 2011, but knew they couldn't get it through because it was too racist. What do I mean by that? Because I don't throw that term around lightly. Racist. They recorded themselves saying, how do we depress the black voter turnout? Because all of these aborigines and these illiterates will get on these high-finance buses and go to the polls. So they crafted a voter ID law that said you had to have a government-issued photo ID. After Shelby County, Alabama implemented it. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund looked and said, whoa, wait a minute. You don't have public housing ID on this list, because that would be a government-issued photo ID. Alabama said, public housing ID won't count for a government-issued photo ID, but really, does it get more government-issued than public housing? But what you see happening there, because Alabama's a really poor state, 71% of those in public housing in Alabama are African Americans. And for many, it was the only ID that they had. So if you knock that ID out of the acceptable types of identification, then access to the ballot boxes stopped. Then Alabama shut down the Department of Motor Vehicles in the Black Belt counties, so that people would now have to go about 50 miles in order to get a driver's license. in order to be able to vote. But if you don't have a driver's license and you don't drive, and Alabama's ranked 48th in the nation in terms of public transportation, so you don't have public transportation to get to the driver's license bureau, how do you get the card that you need in order to be able to vote? So this is how you can begin to shape your electorate. North Carolina did it, and the Fourth Circuit said you have targeted African Americans with nearly surgical precision. What they did in Texas was to say, government issued photo ID, your student ID from a university, a state university, will not count. But your gun registration card will. Because again, this is the way you can shape your electorate and look as if you are being really race neutral in the process. This voter ID worked so effectively that in Wisconsin, because this isn't just a Southern phenomenon, what we're seeing is this thing has metastasized into states where you have a Republican governor and a Republican-controlled legislature. In Wisconsin, 8% in the 2016 election, 8% of whites were blocked from voting because of voter ID. Over 25% of African Americans were blocked because of voter ID. In Wisconsin, in the 2016 election, there were 60,000 fewer votes cast than there were in 2012. 68% of that drop came out of Milwaukee alone, where 70% of the state's black population lives. This is how you target and shape an election, by blocking the electorate. Let's talk about another method, voter intimidation. Again, how do we stop this? How do we stop people that we don't want to vote from voting? We use the power of the state and make it look legitimate. In North Carolina, in the 2018 election, the U.S. Department of Justice teamed up with ICE and subpoenaed all of the voting records from 44 counties in North Carolina, specifically wanting those voting records where English was not the first language. So what that is saying is it's sending a shock through the immigrant community and those who are naturalized citizens and those who are second and third generation. If you vote, we will find you and you will be on the list for deportation. In Texas, right after the 2018 election, because the 2018 election sent shockwaves through, because despite all of the voter suppression, civil society did enormous heavy lifting and got people to the polls, got people their IDs, did that work. The voter turnout rate was the highest it had been in a midterm election since 1914. This is why you see the House getting flipped. This is why you see ballot initiatives coming through in terms of nonpartisan redistricting commissions to try to deal with extreme partisan gerrymandering. So Texas's response, because Texas has an ever burgeoning Hispanic population. So how do we stop them from voting? Intimidation is one of the methods. In January of 2019, the interim Secretary of State held a massive press conference and he said, in my hands, I have a list of 95,000 non-citizens who are registered to vote. And I also know that 58,000 of them have already voted in Texas's elections. Immediately, Donald Trump tweeted, I told you so, massive, rampant voter fraud. We must have voter ID to stop all of these non-citizens from voting. The head of the GOP in Texas, yes, we've got to knuckle down, we've got to bear down. And he had already, the Secretary of State had already called in the Attorney General of the state to begin a criminal investigation. Well, it turned out the list was bogus. So many on that list were naturalized citizens. But what had happened was that it wasn't that they had got their driver's license that put them in the crosshairs of the state. It was that they registered to vote. And it is in that act of registering to vote that then is sending the shockwaves throughout that Hispanic community about, if I register to vote, then I'm in trouble, my family could be in trouble. Maybe it's not worth it. Maybe we should back off. Maybe we should be quiet. That's what this intimidation is designed to do. And know that Georgia does its own version of intimidation. Brian Kemp has gone after the predecessor of the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. It's gone after the New Georgia Project. It's gone after Stacey Abrams. It's gone after African Americans in Quitman, Georgia, who registered to vote and for the first time in like 2011 or 12 had African Americans actually elected to the school board. So using the power of the state to intimidate those who vote and those who register to vote is a way to stop, is a massive means of voter suppression. We also have the cutting back of early voting hours. These states have figured out who votes early and when, and have begun to mark through those days. They've also shut down polling stations. Because what we know, for instance, for African Americans, for every 1/10 of a mile that you move a polling station from the Black community, Black voter turnout goes down by 0.5%. So if you move a polling station, say 4 miles, Black voter turnout will go down by 20%. So Georgia has shut down over 200 polling stations, 75% of them in minority communities. This is a targeted hit. We also have gerrymandering, which is a way to really rig the system and figure out who your electorate will be. And what that really does is when you think about it, when you're looking at the polls, you see how the majority of Americans want to stop the semi-automatic weapons from being in the hands of civilians. They believe that there should be background checks before you're able to get one of these weapons. That believes that there needs to be immigration reform, that we should not be banning refugees or lowering the number of refugees who are coming into the nation. When you look at those polls, you see an American electorate that really wants a very expansive, humane policy that betters all of us. But when you look at the laws that are coming through, they're just the opposite. What you're looking at are the results of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering brought us here. And I've got just a couple of more minutes, but in these methods of gerrymandering, early voting, curtailing early voting, voter ID, voter roll purges, which really look at, for instance, in Georgia, the exact match program, privileges anglicized names. And so what you see is this disproportionate knocking off the rolls or putting people in electoral limbo when they register to vote who don't have these anglicized names. In October 2018, Brian Kemp withheld 53,000 voter registrations. Only a little over 9% were white. The rest were minorities. That has impact. This affects all of us. It affects the policies under which we live. It affects whether we're burning the earth up or whether we're actually sitting here figuring out how to live a decent, humane life. It means it's the difference between whether we have quality healthcare and quality education and decent infrastructure. All of these policies govern all of us, and that is why that Obama coalition is the hit list for this. And that is why we must mobilize, register to vote, tell our friends about registering to vote, know that we're going to have the long lines, and really help those who are standing in those long lines be able to withstand everything, because we need to get the democracy that we deserve and not the kind that they're trying to foist upon us. Thank you.